they are Israelites. And now Paul describes what that means. He says they have the position of a son. They have the glory. And the third thing is they have the covenants. A covenant in the Bible gives a person a certain status. It's bound by an agreement, by a commitment. And such a covenant guarantees peace, success, salvation, atonement, or even reconciliation. Now, there are some theologians who turn that around and say, if we are reconciled with God, we are part of the covenant. We have to be very careful there. That's not necessarily true. It can be the other way around. And we have to be precise here that Israel has the covenants. And what that means, what effects the covenants have is very different. We have to look at them and distinguish the different covenants. And it is actually here that Paul specifically, he doesn't say they have the old covenant and we have the new. He says Israel has the covenants. Now what I did again is I went through the Bible and I simply took the Hebrew and Greek word. The Hebrew word is brit and the Greek word is diatheke, and I took them, where do they appear? And I summarized that for you. The first covenant that pops up is the Abraham covenant. And there was actually one covenant before, and that was the covenant with Noah, but there was it was with all of mankind. That's the only covenant with all of mankind. Now, the first covenant that pops up with Israel is the Abraham covenant, and it has a promise. It's God binding himself to Abraham, and he says, you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. And he says, to your offspring, I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And it is this covenant that is exclusively bound to this line, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We have that several times, but we come to that later. It's an important observation. This covenant is not transferable, not to Ishmael, not to anybody else. The second covenant we encounter in the Bible is the Sinai covenant. It's the covenant of Mount Sinai. And the interesting thing there is that it's in contrast to the Abraham covenant, it's bound to a condition. God tells the people of Israel now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. So it says very clearly that there is an obligation on Israel. And he actually later, before they enter the promised land, Moses tells them, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. This covenant from Mount Sinai was broken over and over again by the people of Israel, by their disobedience, and therefore it had to be renewed. And that is one of the interesting features. It was renewed in the plains of Moab by Joshua later on, by King Asa, and at the coronation of King Joash, and by the kings Hezekiah, Josiah, Zedekiah, and then up to the scribe of Ezra after the exile. It's actually never called an eternal covenant, a Brit Olam. Note that whenever the people of Israel broke by its disobedience the covenant from Mount Sinai, it says in the Bible, God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this Abraham covenant is referred to as a Brit Olam, as an eternal covenant several times. The third covenant that belongs to Israel is the Sabbath Covenant. It's actually a creational order, and it's a unique covenant. I cannot go into it, but it's a very interesting covenant because it later on has a special meaning also for eunuchs and strangers. The Phineas covenant is the fourth covenant I should mention here. It is my covenant of peace. It's a covenant of an eternal priesthood for Phineas and his descendants because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. Then we get closer. The fifth covenant is the David covenant. And like the Phineas covenant, it's a Brit Olam, it's an eternal covenant with a very special quality. And the David covenant actually is bound to the order of creation. It cannot be dissolved. In it, this king of Israel and man of God's, according to God's own heart, is given the promise of a descendant through the prophet of Nathan. He promises that. And it says then, this descendant, shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That's the David covenant. And then the last covenant that is to be mentioned here, it's the new covenant. And let me emphasize here one thing. If today non-Jews, wherever they might come from, and even if they call themselves the church, claim that this covenant is their covenant, in contrast to Israel, they reveal themselves to be thieves. Let me quote what the Bible says. First of all, it's a Brit Olam, it's an eternal covenant. More than any other covenant, it's called eternal covenant. And it has a very different character of and nature. For example, it expressly replaces the covenant of Mount Sinai that was so often broken. And then it says, and the Lord will make a new covenant. Now listen, it says here, with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not with somebody else. Not with the church. And we have to keep that even if it hurts us. I say that as a non-Jew. This covenant, the new covenant, contains complete forgiveness of all sins. And then what is the exciting thing for me, the most exciting thing, is that the instruction, the Torah of God, you might see in your translations mostly the law, but it says the Torah of God will be given into the heart of the people and written into their mind, so that no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. All these covenants define a special, exclusive, and binding relationship between God and the nation of Israel. Now please listen. These covenants bind Israel to their God. And they contain a certain obligation, a certain commitment. But it doesn't say that God is not able to save somebody, to bless somebody, to give somebody peace outside of these covenants. God rather chose Israel. God gave these covenants to his nation of Israel in order to bless the world. Let's not forget that. But let's keep and emphasize what Paul says. They are Israelites, and theirs are the covenants.